Yo, yo, yo. What's good, everybody? What's good? So yeah, I ran into a dead zone yesterday, so I couldn't finish the stream, but I wanted to mention about male feminists. That was kind of the last point. And then also a continuation. I want to talk about something Charles White recently said. And it's starting to make sense to what I was saying yesterday about the war against black men from black women and other black men. So when it comes to these male feminists, that's what they really are. They have a lot of the same talking points. They empathize, sympathize a lot with black women, especially on YouTube. Now, whether they doing it uh, for clout or if they really feel a certain type of way, that's up to everyone's opinion. But either way, it's about it's a lot of male feminists out there. So I'm gonna really start, trying to go in on what a male feminist is and really label those guys that really want to attack other men, because that's basically what they are. You know what I mean? Male feminists. And so I want you guys to think about and even, put comments in the comments, what makes, a black man want to be or want to uphold the feminist agenda. That's something that I want, you all to think about. What makes a black man want to uphold the feminist agenda? How does it benefit how does it benefit them at the end of the day? How does it benefit them at the end of the day? Now, I have talked to brothers, about this, and why some of them, speak so strongly. And a lot of it, like I said yesterday, is they relate to their mom more than their dad. That's one of the main reasons. These are like men that are intellectuals, guys from, even my fraternal organization. A lot of black men relate with the black female, most typically because they were raised by, in a single mother household. So that is kind of the common denominator with a lot of these guys. So I don't want to generalize because I was raised in a single parent home as well, but I just never took the position of a woman. You know what I mean? I just had masculine men in my surroundings, or I just was fortunate to look at the world objectively. You know what I mean? But that is a common denominator as far as that. Also, too, there is there is a war on masculinity. So that is important to know, because typically masculine men, I would say 90s, 90s, it kind of started fading. The 90s, 80s, and before, you know what I mean, masculine men pretty much controlled control things. I would say it started to the change started to happen maybe in the 70s. So so the 70s is important because that's when pimping kind of started out. So all right, so in school, right? I would say that at least the masculine men, for the most part, they were either the bullies or the guys that fought all the time, things like that. And so, other men feel felt left out or threatened because of the bullies that was in high school. So typically the guys that were either known able to be that was known to fight, or the more aggressive ones, they typically had the power, had the control, and a lot of times had the women. You know what I mean, and access to resources. So there's been an attack on masculinity from a bullying standpoint, and the men, the men that kind of fought and supported, the culture, laws, and things like that, as far as taking masculinity out of the schools. A lot of it was from men that wasn't masculine. So the war on men started just from men that weren't as masculine as other men. So that's one part. Um, the second part is, they started wanting to take money out of, you know, masculine, masculine men that had resources. So now you see, um, as it pertains to like somebody like Charles White, for example, he mentioned that um, he's not going to go to another city and check in because why should I check in? Y'all don't ask other race groups of men to check in. So I thought that was a good point, and that was something I never really thought about. It's like certain certain black men, if they want to go to certain cities, or if they want to, get a hood pass or things like that, they got to check in. You going through Compton? Let's say you're in Los Angeles. You're going through Compton, or you're going through, you know, a known black area. You got to check in, and that is the idea that we belong. We belong to them, as far as like, black men belong to the race or the culture. And what Charles White was saying was like, I'm my own motherfucking man. I ain't gotta check in. I have the same rights as white, Asian, Hispanic men. Um, y'all don't come at them like that, so why not come at me like that? And so, I thought it was ironic because a lot of black women look at black men the same too, as like we belong to them, and so have to follow we have to follow a certain guide of rules within the black community that don't apply to nobody else. And what the passport bros do is say, like, fuck that. We are own men. You know what I mean? Y'all don't go to other groups of men and and tell them what they can and can't do. So why is you telling us what we can and can't do? So both those correlations is pretty much signaling that there's a group of men and group of women that look at, what I feel like alpha men. I feel like passport bros are alpha men because we move by our own accord. We don't care about nobody. We don't care what no one else think. And for the most part, we have, the finances to do what we want to do. You know what I mean? We're not controlled. We don't let the society control us. So those situations, when you're your own man, those situations exhibit being an alpha male. Like Charleston White, and his ideology is of an alpha nature. Is of an alpha nature. I'm not going to conform. I'm not going to allow you to treat me different than other people. You know what I mean? I'm not going to get bullied or punked. You know what I mean? Regardless of his frame, you know what I mean? Just the mentality is alpha mentality. So people don't like alphas. Um that is a charge by feminists in general. They do not like alphas. The war on masculinity. That is now that I think about it, that is the war. The war is on masculinity in a nutshell. All the guys that um let's say, come at passport bros, you know what I mean? How masculine? Ask yourself, how masculine are they really? You know, when you can sit on YouTube or whatever platform and just talk about black men all day, like that is alpha. That is nothing is alpha about that. Nothing is alpha about that. You know what I mean? So they are. A lot of people are attacking. Attacking masculinity. The ones that not, before, the ones that had the voices and had things in order and guys in check were the alpha guys. But now the alpha guys either throughout history were in jail, died, died in the military, died in the streets, or just didn't have the education, what I mean, to speak. What I mean, think about what happened with when Stephen A. Smith and Kwame Brown, right? And then you have Mike Wilbon. You had all these basically sportcasters. I would say, I wouldn't not necessarily the typical alphas, right? So when I think of like people that report the news and people that have like this bigger platforms, for the most part, they typically conform to the system. So I don't really look at them as like alpha dogs. So when Kwame Brown broke out and started speaking up, what I mean, that was that alpha male. That was an alpha male coming back, and it shook a lot of people because the non-alphas, I don't want to call them betas. I'll just say not the non-alphas have taken over our society. The non-alphas have taken over in politics. You know what I mean? That's why Trump was popular, because he was an alpha dog. As far as the voices, non-alphas have taken over the voices. So now you start to see emergence of alpha traits, and people push back hard. People push back hard um, on alpha traits. And there's something that we got to really talk about and really talk about deeper. So yeah, the gender war, that's on the surface, but the broad, I would say, the more defined um, conflict is really against masculinity. Against masculinity. So how did non-alphas kind of get birthed in the black community, for example? So I refer to this movie, Dead Presidents, because it ties a lot of what I'm gonna say. So Dead Presidents, I was with Lorenzo Tate. Depending on how old you are, you may or may not be familiar with the movie. But the premise was, it was during the Vietnam War. So this is like the 70s. So you had a lot of black men that got drafted or enlisted, for the war, and a lot of the men that left were the alphas, or made it through, you have to, made it through basic training, and, a lot of them was the alphas, whether they voluntary or involuntarily had to serve. They were alphas or they became alphas. So the men that didn't get drafted and stayed back, it created more available women than men, less competition. And those men, for those men tried to do things to make them feel alpha, because during that time, not serving in the military or any culture, not being able to serve in the military, some people, it looks weak. It makes you look weak. So men had to compensate by either you compensate by either being very educated, say a college student. That's why a lot of college students, you know, what I mean, some were able to not be able to serve, um, or you have to have a lot of money. So in order to have a lot of money, you had back then in the 70s, you had to make money off women. And so pimping pretty much started, you know, in the 70s. I mean, pimping probably always existed, but as far as in the black community and far as like the rise of pimping, it started in the 70s when the alpha males was gone, the non-alpha males, you know, took over. You know, and Dead Presidents was a movie that kind of reflected that. You know, Lorenzo Tate came home from the service, and you know his wife a freak, and you know he dealing with some pimp that was with his woman. You know, so that is so that's the 70s, and you know in the 80s it grew more and more and more. When you look at movies like, so in the 80s you got the movie like I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. So you know, I mean, I'm speaking my age, but I'm Gonna Get You Sucker. That was in the 80s as well. You had men. You had men that was caretakers of the neighborhood, like the stand up guys, like the TV show Rock, that stood up against, you know, what they call thugs, or hoodlums in the neighborhood, and they pretty much was the guys that cleaned up the neighborhood. Um, I think his character was like Hammer and other guys and things like that. Isaac Hayes. So the 80s was showing like basically the bitch niggas was the thugs, or the non-alphas was the thugs, the pushers, or whatever you want to call it, and the alpha males was the ones that was cleaning up everything. So the war against alpha men existed from the 70s. The pimps, the pimps was the non-alphas. The guys that served in the military was the alphas. So the pimps was pretty much competing against the alphas in the 70s. In the 80s and 90s, it was the same thing. You had the people that wanted to run the block against the guys that wanted to stand up. So, and then currently now, where you got to check where you got to check in certain cities, because you know the non-alphas, which I consider gangbangers. These gangbangers are non-alphas. They want you to check in because they want to have the power of the community. In all those situations, 70s, 80s, 90s to present, there's a segment of black men that want to have the power and influence over the community, over the black community. You know, and it's the non-alpha. So when the alphas start taking a stance, that is a serious threat, because they don't want the alphas to control. They don't want the alphas to control society, or to control the black community. And so that is another reason why the passport bros have a lot of hate from men, because the passport bros are alphas. Alphas. Alphas and non-alphas do not get along. They do not get along. You know, it's always like it's like I always think of this analogy. Um, Georgie Porgy pudding pie kissed the girls and made them cry. When the boys came out to play, Georgie Porgy ran away. So when I think about that, Georgie Porgy was the non-alpha, and when the boys came out, the alphas came out. He came out and ran. You know, and so that's the fear of a lot of these non-alpha entities, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's in the streets, whether it's on media news. They don't want alphas to have a platform, you know, because it restores order. The only place that I know of that restores order when it comes to men is prison. What I mean? The alphas are either going to be able to fight, they're going to have some type of clout or financial clout, and that's pretty much it. Or you just some highly respected OG. So alphas restore order, and a lot of people don't like order. When you look at a lot of these black men in the U.S. that's running amok, and these females that support these men that run amok, they like this order. They like this order. When you travel, men that's looking to start families, men that's looking to, let's say, have a wife, those are men. Those are signals saying, we want order. We believe in family structure. We believe in order. And so, by alpha men, passport bros, which are alpha male, we are essentially promoting order, because what we do have has influence. If what we was doing did not have influence, people wouldn't care. People wouldn't care. So that is the main reason. If we had a movement saying, what, we should all, mess with BBWs, you know, get you a BBW because she gonna treat you good. Like, people wouldn't really buy into that, because it's just like, you're not gonna be you can't influence people. You're not gonna influence people to date BBWs. They're not gonna take it serious. But the fact that you could influence men to say, um, travel overseas, and you will become more in your alpha frame. People, a lot of beta, a lot of non-alphas and women, black women, don't like that. And I think a lot of travelers said this, like, when they been overseas for a certain amount of times, or a certain period of time, they feel they see what it feels like to be a man. I even said that. You know what I mean? And not a man as far as like being masculine, a man as far as like not having to be able to be on your purpose. Because the truly, and some people may disagree, and some people like Anton disagree with me on this, but to truly be on your purpose is to not have to think about when women are available, and you don't have to think that's truly manhood. I think somebody mentioned it, like, it's been trips I've been on, other guys as well, like, you don't even think about smashing a chick, because you know that it's there. It's like your refrigerator, right? If your refrigerator empty, what I mean, you can't even concentrate on doing what you got to do on the computer, because you like, damn, I got to put some food in my refrigerator. you know so it takes time out your day and everything, because you got to put food in your refrigerator. But when your refrigerator full, what I mean, your cabinet stocked up with food, what I mean, you're not as hungry if if it wasn't full. So that's an indication of just having abundance and being able to be on your purpose.